Good evening, everyone. My name is Nasser Rabat, and I'm the director of the Kham program here at MIT and the convener of this lecture series, an evening with lecture series. This is our first lecture for the semester, and we have an extremely interesting program for the semester. I'm just going to give you the dates and the names and the titles of the talks so that you'll mark them in your calendars. And probably you've received them in email anyway. On the 18th, I'm sorry, on the 18th of October, which is a Saturday, our colleagues at the Aga Khan Documentation Center in the MIT Library have organized an international symposium with the help of ACPIA with the title of Grassroots Initiatives in Cultural Heritage Preservation, with individuals coming from different cities that have encountered destruction on a large scale and the programs of reconstruction of these cities. So it's somehow sort of like comparative reconstruction studies. That's going to be from 9 to 5 p.m. in room 2-190 here on MIT campus. On the 28th of October, we have our joint lecture with the HTC program, and it is going to be given by Ashish Abikuntak, who is a professor at the University of Rhode Island, and the title of the talk is Bureaucratic Archaeology, State Science, and Past in Postcolonial India. That too is not on a Monday, which is usually our date for lectures. It's on a Tuesday, and it's in what's called the Long Lounge in the fourth floor here at the Department of Architecture. The room number is 7-429. You know, at MIT, we use numbers. The last event of the semester is on the 17th of November, and it's a book launch, a book that I have co-edited with Dean Sharp, who was a postdoc with us a couple of years ago. And the title of the book is Reconstruction as Violence in Assad, Syria. So we have an event, a history of cultural heritage in Aleppo, with two of the contributors to the book, Hegnar Wattenpo, who was an Aga Khan professor here many years ago and now is a professor of history at UC Davis, and Reem Lababidi, who is an Alepian herself and who is an architect and cultural heritage specialist living in Ohio, and me. So we will speak about the book and about the content of the book. Today, I'm very happy to welcome back to MIT one of its sons, I should say. One of our speakers today, Nawaf Bin Ayyaf, is a graduate of our SMArchS program before he went to Harvard and did another master there. I'm going to start by reading the biography, well, in a form of welcome of the two speakers, Nawaf and Faysal, who is on a screen. Nawaf is a researcher, scholar focused on architectural studies and cultural heritage practices. He is currently an advisor to the Saudi Ministry of Culture and serving as chair of the AlMusalla Prize, the topic of our talk today. He holds a master's degree from us, from MIT, and a master's degree in a design study from Harvard. He had lectured at institutions at Harvard, KSU School of Architecture, and the Royal College of Art, and has published research in international design journals. Faysal Tabbarah, hi Faysal, is an associate professor of architecture at the College of Architecture, Art, and Design on the American University of Sharjah, where he has also served as an associate dean, and at Carleton University in Canada as well. He is the co-founder of Architecture Plus Other Things, A+OT, which is based in Sharjah. He was the curator for the National Pavilion of the United Arab Emirates exhibition in the 18th International Architectural Exhibition in the Biennale of Venezia. They are here to speak about their book, and there are multiple books here. I don't know what Nawaf is planning to do with them, but I'm sure actually many of you are going to end up with a copy of the book. This is my copy, so no one touches it, because I actually contributed to that book, and I'm very happy with the way the book had come out. The title is عابر متجذر in Arabic, Rooted Transience, a very beautiful title for the type of building that the book is dealing with and that the book is trying to promote, which is basically an open air prayer space. So the competition, the AlMusalla competition that was sponsored by Al Doraiya Foundation, did actually run a competition on designing musallas. Musallas are no longer in vogue in the Islamic world, but at a certain point, they were the place that people went to prayer for the Eid prayer. And they used to be huge spaces where the whole male population of a city would gather in the Eid prayer. So they are communal spaces, but they are also very polyvalent spaces. And in many cases, they actually ended up not really staying as a sacred prayer space, but becoming something else, metamorphosing into something else. So the idea of actually reviving this notion of a polyvalent space, a space that is at the same time a mosque and not a mosque, at the same time something that actually is reflecting the image of worship and prayer and piety, but and also as something that is trying to fit within its environment. I think the competition was very successful with the Musalla that was built, and I had the chance of seeing it in the Jeddah Biennale, and it is really a wonderful piece of architecture, almost ephemeral, almost impermanent, but not exactly, and a building that allows itself to be appropriated by whoever is going to use it. It is actually possible to pray in the Islamic fashion inside of it, but it's also a place where you could stand and meditate or sit and meditate. Or, as a matter of fact, meet with other people inside of it. So it seems to me that the effort, this rooted transience of what that building is, the effort is extremely successful in alerting us to all of these types of spaces that existed in Islamic history, which are no longer seen as such. As a matter of fact, actually, in a class on history of Islamic architecture, hardly anyone would speak about musallas. We don't survey them, we don't study them. So thank you to both Nawaf and Faysal for having brought this to us. They are going to tell us how this had come into being, how the in the book, the whole thing about the Musalla had come into being. But before I leave the mic, I want to speak about something that we are all suffering from today, which is basically the travel bans. The academic travel bans, and you can see the result of it on the screen, issued by the Trump administration this year, are concentrated on the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And in the case of the Middle East region, the 6 countries directly impacted account for nearly half the population of the region. Faisal is one of those. Moreover, because the Middle East region and the Muslim world are disproportionately targeted by travel restrictions, the bans themselves and their political repercussions have harmed study, research, and scholarship in our field by impeding scholarly exchange and exacerbating tensions that make access to field studies and to sites and archives much more difficult. ACPIA remains committed to preserving our collegial and academic networks with students and scholars now excluded from the US. This has happened to some of the students that we have admitted this year. We have both a professional and an ethical responsibility to defend the right of our students and colleagues who are now being harmed by arbitrary and discriminatory bans on their travel. We will continue to explore all avenues to support affected students and colleagues. Thank you, Zoom. Including by voicing our opposition to these bans, documenting their adverse impact on our scholarly networks, and developing innovative means of continuing scholarly exchanges with affected communities, scholarly communities. Thank you. So, please join me in welcoming Nawaf and Faysal.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nasser, for the introduction. I think, given the introduction that we've been given, I'll probably jump right into the presentation. What you'll see, what all of you will see today, is a reflection on the project's multiple components. There's the architectural proposals from the competition, there's the exhibition, a publication, but I think maybe most importantly today is the background work that we've done, Nawaf and I, that grounds much of these elements and how they come together. Given that this work is conceived and communicated through our many roles, researchers, curators, book editors, but also practitioners, we're taking this moment as just a reflexive attempt to stitch these pieces together to see how we can move forward with them, but also how they can become tools for others to move forward with. Some of this messiness might be gleaned from the recursive nature of the presentation, as we will go back and forth in trying to kind of understand the work that we've done a while ago. So, between 1888 and 1889, a Dutch Orientalist named Christian Snoek Horgonje publishes 2 photo albums of Mecca, its people and also its environment. As far as we can know, so it's kind of ironically, the photos were taken by a Maccabi doctor called Dr. Sayyid Abdel Ghaffar. Abdel Ghaffar also happens to be the name that Christian Horgonje uses when he pretends to convert to Islam to be able to access these kind of environments. There's 2 documents. One is more ethnographic, but it's the second one that's kind of interest for us today, which is much more explicitly a landscape photography album. And the second album opens up with the image of Haram al-Sharif, and in the following pages, it's like a large document, in the following pages, it moves away from the Haram and its urban center. It eventually arrives at Muzdalifah and then arrives at the space of the Miqat. Just maybe for those who don't know, the Miqat is essentially a threshold space that indicates the beginning of Ihram. It's kind of a purity state in which someone who's going to perform Hajj or Umrah must perform in terms of cleansing rituals, but also putting on the Ihram clothing. It's through these images that we see an environment very quickly and radically transforming from a permanently built material condition towards what you can see is sort of the transience and dispersion of these fabric tents around the landscape. What the document really, or the set of images allow us to do is glean the ephemeral material transformations that happen at volume, at mass, very quickly, but also disappear eventually after the Hajj passes or the Hajj season passes. And these images have become very generative for us in trying to understand this idea of a rooted transience.
So we start by asking, what power can a word with an endless range of spatial and material possibilities and interpretations actually hold? The word Musalla was mentioned in the Holy Quran in just one single verse, but although used only once, it has an inherent potential to hold multiple elusive manifestations and contradictions that we try to uncover. Given this elusiveness, the project oscillated between dissecting the Musalla spatially, materially, conceptually, and even linguistically, for the case of Dr. Rabbat's contribution. This was meant to frame it as an enigmatic space that we believe it is, a space that holds within it countless of multiplicities at its core, which in turn opens the door for it to be conceived ever so elastically and loosely, and think about how its historical connotations can be presently inferred. Despite being interchangeably used on occasions, a musalla is not to be confused with a mosque. Emphasizing this distinction was a starting point that drove this project. As the book shows, in contrast to its much more analyzed and dissected counterpart, which is the mosque, a musalla is a transient and fleeting sanctuary for prayer that is closely conjoined with conceptual ideas of temporality and ephemerality, as well as physical ideas of adaptability and flexibility. Whereas, and in complete opposition, it does not get any more permanent and everlasting than the mosque, as it is naturally considered a form of waqf or an endowment, meaning it's a building that usually cannot be sold, abandoned, nor demolished. So part of the allure of tracing the limits of the Musalla typology lies in just how much it does not seek to assert nor to imposed, how it does not wish to be perpetual nor everlasting, but rather how it seeks to exist when a prayer need arises, then ceases to exist when that need becomes obsolete. In that sense, not only is the typology a disappearing one, but at times it is also re-emergent. Whether its cycle of re-emergence is of a daily or seasonal recurrence, once a musalla leaves, it does not necessarily vanish for good. This candid ability to naturally reappear once needed is a true testament to the typology's overpowering spatial dynamism as much as its profound complexity. It is precisely here, then, that the AlMusalla Prize tries to intervene, to address the deceptive vagueness of its seeming demise, with an overemphasis on the musalla's afterlife and its legacy, and what its legacy can actually look like. The inaugural edition of the AlMusalla Prize, which was an integral part of Jeddah Islamic Arts Biennale, was adamant from the very start about its pursuit to create a disruptive competition for a musalla that could have multiple lives beyond its beyond the span of the Biennale. It is meant to move, meant to adapt, and meant to have multiple lives. By stressing on the disassembly and reassembly components as core factors for the competition, AlMusalla Prize doubled down on both the transitory yet perpetual potential for the typology itself, as well as the continual potential for biennales beyond their closing days.
So it's really this elusiveness that was just described that makes thinking about the musalla through the lens of the built environment joyfully but also labyrinthian. For example, when we first kind of came to the project, do we think of the musalla as a space? Do we think of it as an object, or do we think of it as a phenomena? You can see all three in the series of photographs by one of our collaborators, artist Mu'adh Al-Awfi, of essentially the same location. It holding itself as a space, as an object, and as a phenomenon. So if it's a space, some of the questions that we kind of asked ourselves, so if it's a space, do we examine it as a solitary space or as a space that can hold, as Dr. Nasser said earlier, the entire male population during Eid? If we're thinking of it as an object, do we study it as an assemblage of materials put together for the function, or do we study the assemblies that it can enable, again, the large assemblies it enables? If it's a phenomena, then how do we essentially search for the traces that it leaves behind when it disappears? Regardless of which lens, Musalla becomes a really generative tool. So central to this project of Rooted Transience is a question that we kind of framed as a central question for ourselves, which is, what are the essentially architectural, but what are the alternative architectural possibilities that can emerge when we reorient ourselves towards spatial and material narratives and practices rooted in transience? So this becomes a very central question. And the question is that if we found at the beginning, but also eventually throughout the project, it sets up two key actions, again, for us, but also for other practitioners and researchers. It enables us to reclaim latent spatial and material narratives that in turn provoke alternative spatial and material practices that are rooted in transience. Embedded in the question, embedded in essentially the aspirations, is another set of contradictions. It's transience here for us becomes a material condition that we build from, but also build for. So we're building from essentially nothingness, and we're building for nothingness. So to navigate all of these contradictions, all of these kind of elusivities, we've kind of devised a three-part framework for us to be able to think about how the book comes together, how the exhibition comes together, but also how future conversations can come together. And it's framed around three ideas: traces, entanglements, reclamations. Again, there's sort of an archaeological metaphor that becomes apparent to it. It's not lost on us, and we're kind of leaning into this archaeological metaphor. But maybe just briefly to describe, because you'll see this in the book, you'll see that the book is framed under these three categories, or three, we don't want to call them chapters, but essentially chapters. By traces, we're essentially saying, how can we confront the spectral qualities of Musalla? Really, how do we do research, architectural research, on a condition that is meant to disappear. I would maybe even from the book's point of view direct you to Ziad Jamaluddin's reflection. He writes about a musalla as being something without a drawing but not without a history. By entanglements, which becomes a bit more generative and a bit more architectural, essentially we're talking about uncovering latent relationships between past and contemporary material and spatial practices, i.e., how do we highlight spatial and material continuums as like there's relevant in today's work, building on previous work, but these continuums might appear to be fuzzy, so we do think that it becomes important to highlight them. Finally, what we mean by reclamations is essentially recentering particular traces and entanglements and bringing them forward, making them architecturally generative.
Yeah, reclamations do actually come up a lot, at least in our own perception of the multi-layers of this project. One of the first moments of reclamation actually starts with the Hajj terminal. We feel that there is no better venue to accommodate and to host an intellectual interrogation which taps into the dichotomy between temporality and rootedness than the paradoxical Hajj terminal, which now serves as the venue for Jedda's Biennale. Designed by Fazl Rahman Khan of SOM in 1982, it is an example of what Hanif Karahir suggests as technology whispering quietly in his reflective contribution for the book, drawing a through line between the spirit of the Musalla and Fazl Rahman's life work. But perhaps more so functionally than spatially, the AlMusalla Prize was extremely self-conscious of the fact that it would be hosted within the vast embrace of the Hajj terminal and beneath its soaring canopies. How does one decontextualize a design intervention in such an assertive site? And more provocatively even, why even propose introducing a dedicated space for prayer within a project that from inception had intentionally resisted the very notion of such clear-cut designations, given that Fazl Rahman actually originally intended for the space to become the sort of a space that's bustling with different activities all at once without a segregation, including prayer. It is precisely here that one might trace the common thread that actually links the competition's vision with the very space that housed it, influenced it, and gave birth to it. Though they differ in both scale and in scope, both the Hajj Terminal and the AlMusalla Prize do share a deeper kinship. They are spaces of temporary gathering and assembly whenever the need arises. And they are spaces of flow, whether it is the flow of people pouring into the terminal from all over the world en route to Mecca to perform Hajj, or the flow of people to a musalla anxious to receive the spiritual cleansing that a prayer actually promises. Each respectfully challenging rigid paradigms of established typologies and disciplines. The Hajj terminal defied the conventional airport paradigm by pioneering a tectonic gathering place that intentionally functions more like a village than a terminal. And we hope that likewise, the AlMusalla Prize also finds itself entrenched in a parallel struggle of its own, advocating for a reimagining and a redefining of a new typology for prayer, but one that is not a mosque. Just as the rise of modern modes of transportation had driven the ever-growing influx of pilgrims to Jeddah, prompting Fazl Rahman Khan to pragmatically harness new technologies to challenge conventional paradigms and existing disciplines, we argue that the development of modern modes of urbanization have similarly disrupted the way the spatiality of a musalla is actually conceived and represented. So hence, from one notion of temporary to another, rooted transience suggests that the concept of temporary in one historical context cannot be equated with that of another. It is in this light that the musalla becomes not just a space, but rather a reflection on the nature of temporality itself, how it is shaped by the unique historical conditions which propelled it and in which it exists. When asked if he ever considered temporary structures for the Hajj terminal, such as tents, for example, that could actually be dismantled after the Hajj, Khan admitted that he did, but only briefly. So by paradoxically creating a permanent structure from the most impermanent and temporary typology in existence, which is the tent, Fazl al-Rahman Khan was admittedly having fun playing with architectural juxtapositions and contradictions back in 1982. And with Rooted Transience, we are perhaps 43 years late to the party. Faisal, you're mute.
I'm gonna pick up a little bit from the traces of the Hajj terminal, or the traces that the Hajj terminal draws for us, and maybe go back to a time kind of when we were conceiving of the book, and we kind of conceived it through finding these traces for the Musalla. One of the first traces we found in a bound book collection of 48 images by a man who traveled in the Arabian Peninsula around 1916, 1918. And in particular, we're looking at these, what we're calling accidental diptychs. They're potentially taken the same day in February 1918, and they're set in the Dilmun burial mounds in Bahrain, which is, I think, today a UNESCO World Heritage Site. In the first photo on the left, taken kind of from potentially a high vantage point, potentially from atop one of the burial mounds, we see three men with three donkeys. The photo is taken from far away, so we don't really see very well, but it appears that at least one of the men is in so-called European clothing. It's in the second photo where they appear to be the same men, and it appears that this European man disappears. But what we see is a space getting carved temporarily between the mounds, and the photographer, Storis Fox, tells us that it appears that at the center a man is kneeling and he is perhaps praying. And for our eyes, it does look like he is praying. It's taken together, the accidental diptych reveals the sort of spectral condition of the Musalla. It flickers, it appears, and then it disappears. There are other kinds of traces that we looked for sometimes. We had to glean the traces in objects associated with prayer. An example is from the ethnographic album from Harchonia, the books that we kind of started talking about in the beginning of the presentation. And here we have an image titled Sweet Cellar. The caption by Harchonia is a bit long, but it's really one portion of the caption that sparked our interest. He writes around, a pile of wider stalks can be seen to the left of the tray. They're the ones that are kind of leaning down, because the others seem to be sweets. To our eyes, and a little bit maybe not as assertively with Harchonia, it appears to us that this is miswak. It's kind of known as a toothbrush tree. It's an evergreen in the Arabian Peninsula, Indian subcontinent, and also Africa. In Islam, miswak is typically used in connection with prescribed ablution rituals prior to prayer. It's a sunnah to use miswak, basically. But again, it's a lot about this photo, sort of the existence of a miswak within an urban landscape that conceptually starts to suggest the ubiquity of musalla spaces within a now disappearing urban condition. It's the third traces we picked from in 1964's Associated Press, out of all things. In 1964 video set in a German town in Helmstedt, where eventually we see is a series of workers, I think 6 or 7 workers. They appear, we're drawing conclusions here, but they appear to be on a break at one point, and eventually they walk into, and if we can let the video play itself out, they walk into a makeshift prayer space. They're all eventually going to pray on a single mattress on the ground, and there will be a man leading the prayers. I'm just going to let the video play itself out for a little bit. What's kind of fascinating about this is that this impromptu prayer car has a particularly unique precursor, and that actually happens to be the dedicated, what's referred to as a dedicated mosque car in at least one of the Hijaz railway trains. This is kind of a very difficult object to find. There's one or two photos of it. The one you're seeing here is from a cover of a newspaper. What you're essentially seeing is the dome of that mosque prayer car. And we also kind of are told that this prayer car is one of the only cars that was actually built within the Constantinople arsenal, because all the other kind of carriages were built elsewhere. I think they were built in Vienna. So there's a kind of a particular interest at the time by the Sultan to actually make this happen and make it happen internally as almost also a show of force in these kind of new technologies of mobility. I mean, these two scenes, the 1964 one and also the Hijaz Railway mosque car, they highlight the adaptable nature of the Musalla, right? The Musalla going quite literally on the move given these technologies of mobility, but then there's also the sort of expansive and contracting nature, right? Where grand infrastructure of empire and the modest improvisation of workers both essentially have to respond to these technologies of mobility. Maybe the last set of traces I'll mention are again with collaboration with artist Ma'ad al-Awfi, where we kind of proverbially go out into the landscape in search of contemporary existing Musalla spaces. And you'll see here a set of these spaces. The photos are obviously kind of very instructive in the sense that like they become these small objects in the landscape, completely sort of devoid of any other kind of spatial or material interaction. But they also happen to be in their own ways, even though maybe put in a makeshift fashion, but they also happen to kind of have found a rooted resting spot in them. This kind of work that's kind of was a foundational for us conceiving of the book structure, makes its way eventually into the exhibition that takes place in Venice in the Abbazia di San Gregorio. And it helps us think about a curatorial strategy that in a way potentially we recognize, potentially verges on sort of anatopism or just a sense of being out of place. But the curatorial strategy puts these traces that we've found around musallas and spatial and material practices that are in some way, shape or form connected to musallas with the shortlisted architectural proposals for the AlMusalla Prize. So one example you'll have is sort of a display for East's work. East is the winning proposal, the one that was built that you saw earlier. And so we have here a few images of the East proposal, some of their drawings in juxtaposition with a series of archival images that are predominantly coming from two different places, the Chatterjee Photographic Archives as well as the Matson Collection. And again, there is a form of kind of anachronism here which we recognize, and a form of like a being out of place, but we're trying to make some of these connections a little bit not fuzzy. We think the spirit of Chatterjee going out into the landscape and photographing, documenting a disappearing environmental condition that becomes a generative repository of kind of material practice is in some way, shape or form instructive for a practice like East. And they seem to be doing similar things, even if it's not so explicit. So one way from our point of view is to frame East's work is that it really is conceived against a grain of modernity in a lineage such as the one that can be seen in the Chatterjee archive. What you can see here is really East's work deploying multiple rooted kind of practices, even though this project is meant to be disassembled, meant to kind of travel to multiple places, meant to become 4 or 5 different projects at the same time. But they always maintain the courtyard typology. Even sometimes one can read nested courtyards within each other. They have kind of a strong affinity to an idea of fabric as both structure, skin, but also enclosure. They're also kind of very conscious about repurposing materials such as the use of the sort of compressed palm fiber in their structural elements. The same curatorial strategy, and I'll finish with these kind of couple of images. The same curatorial strategy was deployed for the other 4 shortlisted projects, but we also tried to kind of have them have a conversation with each other, because we found that the 5 proposals, even though they were conceived separately, kind of embodied some of the ideas that we're kind of investigating, even subconsciously. And it became kind of an important thing to highlight. So for example, what you're seeing here is 2 proposals, one by Anastas Brothers and one by Asif Khan Studio. They're very different in nature. The Anastas proposal is heavy, it's stacked, it's all dry stack stone, whereas the Asif Khan Studio proposal has spectral qualities in the sense that it's made out of carbon fiber weave, it's kind of completely disappears from the landscape. However, they both kind of build on what we found to be rooted practices. They also kind of both simultaneously reflect on the nature of repetition as kind of a meditative component. And the last kind of entanglement we have here is putting together or pairing Sahel Hiyari's work with Sumaya Dabbar's studio's work. Again, very different in nature. Sahel's work is kind of an earthen carved out block, completely stereotomic, whereas on the other hand, Dabbar's work is kind of again, a spectral canopy. But they both seem to have the sense of the archaeological, even though materially very different, they're in spirit very similar, in the sense that there is a sense of this being there but not being there. It's a musalla when you need it to be a musalla, but it's also another kind of enclosure when you need it to be another kind of enclosure.
Yeah, so just to take a step back, with the emphasis on the afterlife and the legacy components, the winning Musalla had a meaningful journey this year of symbolic stops, moves, and encounters. After being first introduced in Jeddah, we took parts of it on the road to Venice for the exhibition that Faisal just talked about. So as a city, Venice was always considered a gateway towards the East. The intertwining of Venice and the East from an architectural perspective has manifested in many ways, from the graceful sweep of pointed arches to the intricate mosaics and ornate carvings that echo Byzantine and Islamic artistic traditions. It is evident to the discerning eye just how deeply Venice has actually drawn from the architectural repertoire of the East. This intricate narrative of interdependence between Venice and the East, woven through the fabric of the built environment, runs deep within the very history of the Venice Architecture Biennale itself. In its second iteration in 1982-1983, the theme Architecture in Islamic Countries was chosen by curator Paolo Portoghesi, who himself was in the midst of a similar sort of personal journey of self-discovery, having been commissioned to design some of Europe's grandest mosques. Portoghesi saw in the 1982 biennial a chance to engage in dialogue. He envisioned it as an opportunity to issue a collective call that urged the cultural world to dismantle barriers and bridge over divisions, working together to resolve conflicts of juxtapositions and false perceptions that have long kept the two worlds apart. So what you see here are images dedicated sections from that 1982 biennial for the works of Mohammed Makkiya, Abdul Wahid al-Wakil, and Hassan Fathi. So for the AlMusalla Prize to have the 19th edition of the Venice Architecture Biennale as its first introduction to the world is, in essence, another reclamation of a long lost and misconceived narrative. It is a chance to shift a perspective that no longer is being dominated by a Western gaze, but one that could just as easily have come from within. For Rooted Transience, we carried with us fragments from a prize that sought to enrich the architectural discipline at large, ironically won by a practice called East. In an attempt of an intellectual reclamation, we actually found ourselves stepping into the Abbazia di San Gregorio on the Venice Grand Canal, armed with a deep and locally rooted knowledge of a subject often overlooked by the perceived West. We are also not making a fashionable choice, as Portoghesi had put it, but we are issuing a call to provoke a type of dialogue similar to the one that he had envisioned but has since disappeared. The pursuit of this dialogue steered AlMusalla's next steps, which was just unveiled actually earlier this month in Bukhara, Uzbekistan. This move from Jeddah to Bukhara by way of Venice retraces crucial historical connections between Islamic societies in two different regions and giving them new contemporary resonance. In its move to Bukhara, the Musalla embraces a new setting that has important common ground with the original context. Jeddah and Bukhara are both defined by their histories of openness to ideas and cultures from near and far. As a port city on the Red Sea, Jeddah was the point of entry for pilgrims traveling to the holy sites of Mecca and to Medina. It has hosted Muslims from around the world who have contributed to the city's identity and its culture. Bukhara was the leading seat of learning along the Silk Road, an incubator of theology, science, art, architecture, and commerce for over 1,000 years. The location in Bukhara is also very rich in symbolism. Staged against a majestic 16th century Kalan mosque, it perfectly encapsulates the dialogue between the transitory and the permanent, between the mosque and the musalla. Taking al-musalla through different contexts has actually allowed us to uncover its multiplicities and to prove its elasticity. It has allowed us to raise questions that reach far beyond its inflated confines and into the heart of the architectural discipline at large, questioning some of its core foundations, probing its merits, and countering some of its most prevailing narrative. To close, we want to give a nod to the artwork on the cover of the book by Judith De Keer, which sort of became the identity of the Rooted Transience project. In the 19th century and during a particularly extreme drought in Najd, poet Muhsin al-Hazzani was not able to go out and perform Salat al-Istisqa, which is the rain prayer, with his town people. As a lamentation, he recited a poem that opens with a call for prayer. Experimenting with forms of prayer, al-Hazzani shows us the boundless and ephemeral ways in which dua can actually be performed. Judith De Keer translates al-Hazzani's work by expressing its harakat, its diacritics, which she sees as resembling both rainfall, but also stacked rows of prayer carpets. De Keer refers to this process as distillation, in which she attempts acts of anti-translation given the absence of official modes of translating or transliterating harakat from Arabic to English. But we also see it tying back to the linguistic root of the word musalla, which could perhaps refer to the silent prayer in which we only use traces of words forming in the worshipper's mouth. Thank you very much. Whatever you prefer. Okay, I can do it, that's fine. If anyone has any questions for either me or Faisal or the crowd, I mean, we have a full stacked room here. Please.
Okay, is it on?
Yes.
Okay.
Faisal, can you hear?
You want me to speak louder? Or that now? I can hear myself. Is that better, Faisal? Thank you both for this wonderful, really interesting talk. I'm familiar with design and I do a lot of work with the Miscar Institute, so I was excited to get to hear more about your project and research. And my question, and I'm just still sort of absorbing everything, so I'm thinking out loud. You set up the binary a bit towards the end of temporary transience versus permanence of buildings. And towards the end of your talk, I was thinking a lot about how I come across in much older, centuries older sites, especially in rural areas in Egypt and Jordan, you come across people repurposing buildings that have been abandoned for centuries as prayer spaces. and some of them might have been mosques from, like I'm thinking of some lesser well-known, more deserted desert palaces in Jordan. I've seen sort of these kinds of transient prayer spaces from a desert palace, from like a bathhouse, or even maybe a mosque from many, many centuries ago. So I was just curious about that in terms of your typology and your research. If you think about the repurposing of so-called permanent like very old buildings, because time shows a lack of permanence really in buildings as well, and how that fits in, or what you think about that in terms of the AlMusalla sort of typology. You beautifully trace that.
Yeah. I think like one of our most important sort of notions that we try to basically put forward is that AlMusalla does not have a typology. We're basically starting from scratch because we cannot trace a specific typology that we can attribute it back to the Musalla. A prayer has always existed. Prayer doesn't always happen in a designated space for prayer. So that's part of the allure of the Musalla. It can be its own place, but it can be sort of us basically trying to find the place that works, right? The need comes and goes, but the practice is always there, you know? I don't know, Faisal, do you want to build on that? You're muted.
I mean, there's one component or there's one kind of important, again, generative source that we didn't really discuss today, but there's a hadith sharif that essentially, and I'm gonna paraphrase as much as possible, but essentially it says that God has made the earth a place of prostration. So the word actually used in Arabic is masjid, but it doesn't necessarily mean masjid as, at least our understanding is, it doesn't mean masjid as mosque. But the way we take the hadith is that it does suggest that it's almost an invitation for the repurposing or the adaptability of these buildings, where you can essentially pray everywhere when the need for prayer emerges. So, the other thing is, we are also suggesting, I think very clearly, that Musalla is adaptive by nature. So, I think what you're potentially suggesting that's kind of accurate is the oxymoron is not really so black and white. It's a spectrum. Right? The oxymoron that we're suggesting in the title, like, it's purposefully kind of polemic, but it is a spectrum. And the photo we show, like, of a man praying and then like a kind of a precisely drawn mosque that's an endowed mosque, is really kind of a false polemic. So I kind of appreciate the kind of the wrench that you're throwing into the polemic.
Well, and that's great. And I think I was just thinking, how does that strengthen also the concept of AlMusalla? That any place can become a place for contemplation and prayer. And likewise, any of these sites that used to be holden or spaces for prayer can likewise become a Musalla or also any prayer space. So thank you both very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, and I love how you have theorized the concept and presented the exhibition.
I just note that Azra was one of the jury members for the inaugural edition of the prize, and Halim Al-Kawi as well. So thank you both for being part of this endeavor.
Thank you also for having us part of this experiment. I'm curious about the next edition because as I'm seeing the pictures of Musalla in Bukhara, fantastic, and the different angles where you see the dome behind and how that merges with it, and like a new typology evolves, but then the two monuments next to each other. So there is something of that makes me curious about this potential for the next iteration. That could speak to cultural mobility or the mobility aspect of the Musalla. Because the first one was quite specifically tailored to the locality of Saudi Arabia, and also the winning proposal works with palm trees, with it could be implanted in many different regions, but it also works with Bukhara context. So are you thinking about I don't know, different framework for the brief, next challenge, will it remain open? What are your thoughts from learning from the first iteration?
Yeah.
In
So-
terms of keep expanding?
Yeah, it's a very timely question. We're currently strategizing and sort of putting together the best strategy for the next edition. But as we do that, we do realize that we're just starting. So everything is an experiment right now. So when we jumped into this, we didn't know that it's gonna actually keep on moving from Jeddah to Venice to Bukhara. Maybe there's another stop after Bukhara after its final sort of resting place, which is to be back to Jeddah. But as we continue to strategize right now, a leading direction for the next edition, at least, is that the final destination will be embedded within the program itself. For the first edition, we really wanted to be as experimental as we possibly could. We realized that architects are usually used to work within a confined program, and we wanted to change that. So we actually left it open for all these shortlisted architects to think about where their proposals could actually end up beyond the Biennale. So some people had clear ideas in mind, but our intention was to present a disruptive sort of paradigm to how architects actually work within a confined program for the competitions. So for the next edition, we're really thinking about trying to have a resting place that is chosen from the get-go. And basically, the design challenge becomes, how do you find commonalities or a common ground for a design that fits two completely different contexts? I can't tell you where exactly, but it's going to be two completely different contexts. So I think that's the good challenge. Please.
First of all, thank you for the presentation of the book and the competition.
We only have 12 copies, so
Make sure you take mine.
you're on the first row, so yeah, that helps.
So, what I really liked about the idea is the fact of trying to present a Musalla is more of capturing a mirage. It's a performance that takes place in time and space, almost, a performance that happens in time and space and then vanishes. I think it's a bit goes against that idea if you fixate a space for a Musalla, because it's performance that happens and then goes. But fixating the space, for me, I think goes against that. So I was thinking probably, I would like to hear what you think about that, because I also want to know about the criteria of the selection. How would you, why did it, for me, I was thinking probably something that symbolizes the performance rather than recreating the space could have been a better suit. But although I found that probably using fabrics, using woods, using something that you can easily dismantle, aligned with that. But my question is, why you decided to go with it as a work of architecture other than probably a work of art, something that symbolizes the idea, the performance, the ephemerality of it, rather than fixating an architecture space?
That's a good question, but I would actually push back on us fixating. It's gonna move. It's gonna sort of operate into completely different contexts. But the other element that we're introducing is that when it moves, it can adapt to the new context. It doesn't have to be necessarily the exact same thing that actually moves from Jeddah to the other context. We're gonna leave it open for them to actually think about a sort of things that they can do for it to basically not lose the actual integrity of the original design, but perhaps make it more fitting within the new context, right? Yeah,
in
thank you. I think we have a question here.
Thank you. I was here when the talk happened about this. So again, I'm so happy to see it in Bhutan. It's beautiful. Um, when you're talking about, let's say, other contexts in which maybe even the competition can take on new challenges, and there has been quite a lot of talk at design schools about housing for refugee camps that sort of emerges very quickly deployable, much swifter in picking it up. Do you think something like this can go into that realm? That it's like a very quickly deployable space that comes up in state of war, or
Of course, I mean, it can sort of become a prototype of sorts, or a toolkit, or as long as it sort of still pertains to it actually being a prayer space, not to be used differently. I think our main idea here is that we really want to narrow down on this elusive typology, and within the span of 10 years, let's say, or 20 years, hopefully have enough research and studies on what could actually define this elusive space. So I think that's our driving idea. But yeah, I mean, we're not closing any doors right now. We're really continuing to basically steer the ship as we build it. Please, Huma.
Thank you both of you so much. What a beautiful presentation. I wanted to start with just appreciating a few things and then sort of framing the questions. So first, I really love the citation of the hadith about masjid and the sort of talking or thinking about the world as a place of prostration, you know. I thought that was really beautiful. I also really appreciated the sort of attention that you're paying to the duality of building from transience and building towards or for transience. And I think this is where my larger question lies, beyond even the scope and the ambition of the prize itself, is I do understand the building from transience, and I think you do such a great job of juxtaposing that photographic disparate archives with the sort of contemporary projects. I'm excited to kind of dig in more and learn more about how you do that. But what is sort of the larger vision and ambition that you had in terms of this latter part of building for transience? Like, what is the sort of larger intervention here, or desire, or hope, or ambition for the future, you know, of architectural practice, whether it's in relation to Musalla Typology or in the way other sorts of practices? Because I felt that you're really trying to do something bigger than trying to define the prize, or even trying to define Musalla Typology. So if you want, here's some space to talk about those.
Yeah, no, I mean, to us, we really, I mean, stepping into this edition of the prize, we really didn't want to take a normal sort of route of even for the publication, even for the exhibition. We really didn't want to take a generative sort of like route of this becoming such a normal sort of accompanying prize publication. We really wanted to look far beyond the surface. And I think Faysal's strategy of initially looking at the archives for inspiration and trying to draw the line between the historical practices and the current contemporary ones is a very timely and a very smart notion. So I think I'll leave the floor to Faysal if he wants to add.
Thank you for this. I think it's Huma, right? I recognize your voice. There's a two-part answer. One is it's a cheeky answer, which is like, I don't know what we mean by building for transients. The less cheeky answer is, and I think it's potentially embedded in your question, or the answer is embedded in your question, which is, what other kinds of practices does thinking through the Musalla hint towards outside of the world of the Musalla, right? So there's a nested ambition here. There is the ambition for the AlMusalla Prize to essentially become a space in which architects can test certain ideas around the Musalla, but then what can that also instruct and be generative for things outside of the Musalla? So there's a gentleman earlier that spoke about refugee housing. That comes with its own set of complexities, specifically with refugee housing. So maybe we are not there yet, or we will not get there, but are there other kinds of practices that thinking through the Musalla can generate? Can it challenge different ways of thinking about supply chains? Can it challenge different ways of thinking about building for permanence? Maybe to the first question, can it challenge different ways of thinking about adaptive reuse? So there is a larger ambition here of what building for transients, but I think maybe it's like we're just opening the door.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you, Faysal and Nawaf. My question, the sites of the Musalla that you have sort of showed us are all in exhibition. I mean, Musalla here becomes as an object that's on display, it travels. And I was thinking if, like to push for that and think of what's a Musalla object on display for you? I know in Venice it has a fragment, and and with that there are different registers of acquisitions and sales that happen. I think of Musalla as an object in a museum, and if that is part of your next brief, or if you've taken that direction, or if you thought of it instead of thinking of it as like a space that enters the public civic city.
One of the most important sort of notions that we really wanted to experiment with by framing this inaugural edition of the prize as a traveling sort of a pavilion is that we wanted to see how different people react to the space. We wanted to raise awareness or sort of to gain sort of attraction just on the word Musalla itself, right now, right? So the fact that we're building on the Jeddah Biennale, that we're building on the Venice Biennale, on the Bukhara Biennale, I think allows us to experiment with completely different set of crowds, with different contexts, with different ideas, just to see how they sort of react to the site, but also how do they get to practice their spirituality in this sort of moving pavilion that's in this artistic sort of biennale, right?
I don't know if I want to guess who. I'm at the point where like I'm having to now guess the people that are asking the questions, and I can recognize their voices. So I don't know if tell me if I'm wrong. I don't know if this answers your question, Metha. But Nawaf, if you go to page 43, I think one of the strongest aspects of East's proposal is the fact that it can be dismantled. I mean, that may be part of the earlier promise is that this thing gets dismantled into multiple places and then gets disseminated into the public realm, that it doesn't exist as an object in a museum. I mean, even in taking it to Venice, there was kind of, this was on East's end, they were adamant that it gets placed in a particular orientation, so the fragment becomes a wall, it becomes a marker towards a particular orientation, which might indicate prayer. The question was a bit choppy to hear, but I don't know if this image starts to answer some of that.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. Faysal, you allowed me to come in when you use the word cheeky, so I'm going to be cheeky with some observations. The first thing to say is you may not have realized is as somebody taking part in something, you first question yourself, because the world is full of biennales, art exhibitions, and refugee housing. Every school I go to, you do cute projects all over the world, and then some American school drops something in Rwanda, and suddenly we all celebrate. This wasn't that, I have to say. And I'm talking retrospectively, because when we first came out, the competition was questionable. What are we going to do? Because it's difficult not to do the things. So one of the challenges that I'm going to leave you with is, how do you unsee this, get to the next step? My view is that with the scholarly and research work you're doing, it does introduce a lot of interesting things. For me, I woke up and came to school, out of bed to come and do this, because I could see the innovation potential. Because innovation is slowing down so much in terms of the real things we can build and can't build for, that I thought this would be an opportunity. And for me, the question that East and Brian Davitt, who's an artist, put to us as engineers was really worth staying awake for. So in a sense, I'm challenging you to find a way of bringing back agency to architecture and people who make things, and also artists, because I think there was a moment in here where somebody, me, saw that agency, and we all really worked well together without becoming the other. How are you going to achieve that again?
So the past edition of the prize, we really insisted on, we wanted teams to get together, consisting from architect, artist, and an engineer. I think that was a good approach, but maybe not the finest. Why? Because, I mean, we're really adamant that we really want to keep continuing sort of encouraging cross-disciplinary sort of collaboration, but we don't have to specify it to engineer, artist, architect. Someone maybe wants to work, I mean, this is something that Faysal and I really discussed a lot. Someone maybe wants to work with an ethnographer. Someone maybe wants to work with somebody that's coming from a completely different background. I think we really want to keep encouraging this multidisciplinary collaboration spirit as a core foundation for the prize, but maybe not artist, architect, engineer. I think that's very limiting to the potential of what we can do.
All right, so I'll ask not a question, actually. I don't have a question. I was encouraged by the presentation, and especially by both of your answers, to go to a topic that is very dear to my heart. I've spent my career trying to argue that Islamic architecture has lessons to teach architecture, and I have failed. Architecture sort of like resisted the idea of learning from the architectural heritage of the Islamic world. So I'm looking at this, especially with your explanations and your answers, and I'm seeing a way of actually bringing out from the Islamic architectural heritage elements that are not necessarily identified very strongly with the word Islamic, because this used to be the problem, but that have a heritage of thinking about space and design and light and movement and temporality and so on, all the kinds of principles that contemporary architecture is grappling with. And so the aspiration, the hope, the wish, perhaps the proposition to you is to perhaps actually move in that direction, not necessarily just developing around the Musalla, but thinking of yourselves as the carriers or the harbingers of elements from the vast Islamic architectural heritage that could be presented to the design community, whichever that design community is, in order to be inspirational, in order to actually make Islamic architecture be part of the design and architectural heritage of the world. So I'm saying that this seems to have started doing it. and your explanation has added layers and layers of potential. And I'm just hoping that Musalla is not the first and the last element that you're going to be dealing with.
Hopefully so. Hopefully so. Um, I mean, we really realized since we first started that this is not something that we could resolve within a single sort of edition of the prize. But we're really aiming high. We're hoping that we're sort of like punching beyond our weight, and I'm fairly optimistic that this has the potential to influence the architectural discipline at large, and this is why we chose Venice. This is why we're choosing a biennale like Bukhara, sort of to reshift that paradigm in a way that is not sort of uh, occupied by the Western gaze, right? Faisal, do you have any?
Yeah, I appreciate Dr. Nasser, I appreciate the proposition, and I think we might be on the same page in the sense that potentially the first exercise in that proposition was taking the 5 shortlisted architects and proverbially shaking them and telling them that your work can be instructive, but is also instructed by something that has come. And I think all of the shortlisted architects, to a certain extent, and the winning proposal, subconsciously know that, but the initial hard work was like to externalize it and just show it in images. Like your work comes from this, or potentially comes from this, and can potentially be generative for others.
Any last question, or should we release our speakers? Well, thank you both.
Thank you.